All right, well, thank you for that introduction. I want to express really what an honor it is for me to be able to be the keynote speaker here, to be able to speak at a conference that I myself once presented at in 2009 at Schoene University, and to be able to speak in front of professors that once graded me and
we can still change that.
We still can. Yeah, professors I still admire. We can probably change that too. And most importantly, to talk to students who are sitting in a chair that I myself sat in less than 10 years ago, really not that long ago. So I want to begin my comments today by citing a recent research study that was published in the Journal of Democracy in, I think, January 2016. The authors of this article had a very elegantly simple research question. Take people who have never lived in anything other than a democracy and ask them, how important is it that you continue to live in a democracy? Very simple survey methodology here. The results, which may surprise you, maybe it doesn't surprise you, they found that over time, support for democracy as an idea, an ideal, had been in decline. And this was true in the cross-national sense. They looked at this in Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, a few other places, Sweden and the UK, and then of course right here at home. And they found two things. One, the level of support, while differing across country, for living in a democracy is currently at a lower rate than it has been since the late 1960s, early 1970s. And to the, to the degree that the term millennial has any real meaning outside of just an age designation, they found that actually it is the millennial generation that is least connected to this form of government or this form of ideal. So according to the study here, millennials, only 30% of them, of you, of us, I'm not sure where I fall here, but only about 30% of millennials in the United States say that it is essential that they continue to live in a democracy. So that is something that maybe would have surprised us even just a few years ago, but 2017 does seem a little different, and this was something that you touched on a little bit briefly. Let me expand on that. That is a finding that I think should be understood not as a glitch of sort of global economics or macro social trends, but really an outcome of what happens when we start to lose faith in the building blocks of our societies. When you think of something very large, something very big like a government at the national level that has millions of people living under it, that is a giant thing, but it's really just made up of the individual norms, values, and institutions that create the bedrock of society. Now, I'm not the only person or the first person, and not the last person to talk about and to highlight this growing distrust of institutions. Just the term distrust is getting thrown around a lot in the last year, and probably even going back before that. But distrust of what exactly? It's never fully said what it is you don't trust or what it is I don't trust. Just the idea has certainly taken root in our society. Now, if you dive into the literature a little bit more, you'll start to see that more specific research articles that, instead of asking about an ideal like a democracy, that ask, how much do you trust the education institutions that you yourself are a part of? How much do you trust the local governance in your town, in your city? Trust in these institutions is very much at an all-time low. And why is this meaningful? Well, for the very simple reason that institutions create the rules of the game that we play by. As of right now, according to the most recent General Social Survey data, we may distrust institutions, but we still trust each other. That is an interesting thing, and I start to worry about at what point distrust in institutions becomes distrust in each other. It's not hard to see why that would matter. If you have a belief, if you really believe that your neighbors are playing by the rules and the institutions that you are a part of and participate in are trustworthy, it's very easy for you to also play by the rules. But once you lose faith in the local institutions that make up your day-to-day life and the people around you, once you lose that faith, then there's not a lot that's holding you to the rules of industrialized democracies or the rules of any type type of system of government, for that matter. So we're seeing now a decline of trust in sort of the big ideas of society and also the building blocks of society. And so I would ask you, if we kind of go through the list of major social institutions, think about, even in your short life and my short life, you can probably highlight numerous places in which you've seen these institutions either fail, and maybe not at the overall level of collapse, but certainly violate the social trust or the social contract in some way or another. So I can think, I just turned 30 last week actually, I can think just in my adult life, I have seen failures at the political level, things like 9/11, for example, things like the botched case for the invasion of Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction. So I've seen this at the political level. I've seen this at the economic level, the housing crisis, the government, or excuse me, the economy that failed right when I was graduating college and then decided, you know what? Always wanted to go to grad school, not get a job anywhere else. No, I've seen that, and then we've seen this at numerous other countries as well. The sovereign debt crisis that has choked Europe into stagnation, and the painful austerity measures that are designed to rectify that. I've seen the student debt crisis get worse and worse, and nobody really seems like they're doing much about that. So we've seen this at the political level, at the economic level. You can see failures in religious institutions. Just the Catholic sex abuse scandal comes to mind. You've seen this in public safety institutions, just thinking of police brutality, but I'm sure there could be many other examples that I just can't think of off the top of my head right now. I've seen this even in educational institutions, not to bite the hand that's currently feeding me, but you think about the student debt crisis most specifically, but also these other things like cheating scandals, academic misconduct scandals that never really get solved, or the campus sex abuse problem that has been sort of a national conversation in recent years. When I was thinking about what I wanted to say to this group here, I was going through this list of institutions in my head, thinking about these failures, and I was struck by how little I myself maybe trust some of these institutions. So you shouldn't misunderstand my remarks or my comments here as you have no reason to distrust institutions. Certainly, a healthy distrust is probably a good thing. But you can have too much, right? You can have too much, and that's my worry. I wonder what exactly happens when institutional distrust spills over into personal distrust. And I think that, as I am not a cultural sociologist by any stretch, that's not where my training is, but I do generally believe that the type of art or cultural products that a society produces in many ways closely mirrors whatever is the cultural center of that society at the time. This is why you can read a book that was written 100 years ago, and your English professors will tell you how that's a reflection of the society in which it was written. You can learn about 19th century Russia by reading some of these things. So art is not my expertise at all, but I think it's meaningful here. And I would ask you to stop and think a little bit about your favorite television franchises or your favorite movie franchises. What is most popular? What is selling? And a lot of these things really do seem to deal fundamentally with a broken social contract, or at least some aspect of a broken social contract. So just running through off the top of my head here, a show like Breaking Bad, don't trust the healthcare system. A show like The Wire, don't trust cities and the people who run them. This resurgence of sort of the superhero genre, I think, is also very reflective of the idea that there are these things that are out of the control of any institution, and you need some type of supranational, supergovernmental group that can deal with that. And that is reflective of, I think, a style of thinking we're very eager to embrace for many reasons. And then Game of Thrones, I guess, right? I mean, don't trust anybody, anywhere, ever, at any time. Really, the idea here that I'm trying to make is that a lot of the media that we interact with is very reflective of a style of thinking that has been tainted by distrust. And again, I want to reiterate, little distrust is probably a good thing, as we've seen by many institutional and governmental failures, even in just my time, in my adult life, since I started paying attention. Now, that being said, maybe there's reasons to distrust education systems. There may be reasons to distrust the government. There is one institution that consistently, over and over again, commands the lowest level of trust of any of them when these things are ranked and sorted. And that is the mass media. Maybe you knew where I was going with that. But a recent Pew Research study on this found that only 6% of Americans would describe the media as extremely trustworthy. I believe was the language used there, extremely trustworthy or something along those lines. 6%. And so in the absence of belief in real news, we're left with the rise of fake news and alternative facts. And there isn't a lot of checks and balances on this system once the trust leaves a society or once it leaves an institution. Now, overall, I think that building trustworthy institutions is probably a really difficult thing. And for the vast majority of us, we've generally taken it for granted that the institutions exist and they are stable and they can be relied upon, which is not always the case when you look at other countries throughout the world. But I worry about this because while it may be difficult to build trustworthy institutions, I suspect that building trust back into an institution that has already lost it is probably significantly more difficult. That leads me to kind of, that's part one here. That leads me to the second part of my talk, which is where you come in. You, as the graduating class, I assume the majority of people in here are graduating seniors. You are the future. And I don't mean that in some like figurative sense of you are the future. No, I mean that quite literally, like you're about to go get jobs. You're about to go to grad school. You are about to go and contribute to the very same institutions that we as a society apparently have lost trust in. And this is where I think the research process and your understanding of it that has been gained over the last year, maybe 2 years, depending on how long you've been working on your project, this is where you become the future of society in, I think, some really meaningful ways. If you accept the overall argument that I'm making, that trust in institutions has declined and that has severe consequences for how we interact with each other and how we interact with our institutions, then you're led to the question of how do we trust our institutions more? And the answer is beautifully simple, but also really hard at the same time, as many questions are in any type of research. The only way to trust our institutions more is to trust our institutions more, really. And the only way to do that is to contribute to more trustworthy, transparent institutions going forward. So I look back on my first research presentation when I was a senior in college and presenting at this very conference. I'm struck by how little of that paper and project I remember. I don't remember what my coefficients were. I barely remember what my variables were. I can tell you, the kind of the title of my talk, but I don't remember the literature I cited. What I do know I got out of that, though, and certainly took into my career as a researcher and as a professor now, there are 3 things that set me up for. And this is what you are going to take with you into the institutions that you are going to become a part of, regardless of whether you ever do another research study ever again. The first is this ability to think long term. If I asked you, how long have you been working on your research project, you're going to say, I guarantee, at least a full semester, if not longer. Probably a full year. I worked on mine for close to a year. Started it in the fall semester and presented at this conference in April. And so much of college, so much of the things you get out of college college is organized week to week, and really day to day in a lot of ways. You got to take this exam today. You got to write that paper next week. You have to take, do this group presentation in a couple weeks from now. It becomes very easy to lose track of the forest, through the individual trees of your responsibilities. And all of you are probably involved in way too many things as it is. So your life almost becomes jumping from one responsibility to the next. But then you think about how how few projects in the working world in grad school really come down to, I'm going to read a few articles and write a research, write a paper, and maybe I spend a week working on that. You've had this ability to think long term that college, if you don't seek it out, I'm not sure that you really get that. And so I commend you for doing that, for taking on a project that you had to start from almost no knowledge of, and then ultimately come up with a finding or something worth telling us. And that's a real skill. That's a real skill that I think our institutions are sorely in need of. The ability, if you go into urban planning, for example, we're not necessarily, the trains and the buses need to run on time tomorrow, but we also have to know what our transportation needs are going to be like 10 years from now. And so this ability to think long term is an important part of your contribution to any institution going forward. So that's number one, and that's something that I don't know if you pick up if you don't actually seek it out. But it's something that I got out of doing my first research project. The second is what I learned through my research project, my senior thesis, through just being pushed by Dr. Jones and just through almost sheer will, that I could do difficult things. And that's one of those things, like I bet a lot of you probably thought a little bit about, do I actually want to do a research project? Do I actually want to take on something that's going to be a lot harder than just taking a class, writing 2 papers, and taking a final? You've probably put more time into this than you have any other assignment throughout your college career. And again, I commend you for that. And that idea of, like, the idea of building more trustworthy institutions is going to take people that have a long-term view of things and people that can start from almost no knowledge of a problem and get to knowledge of that problem, okay? And that leads me to kind of this last issue here, the last thing that I think is very important. What you've learned probably most clearly is how to evaluate information. It was told to me in grad school by my advisor that you never know something quite as well as when you're about to teach it to a room full of undergrad students, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. More to the point though, you never really know material as well as you do when you have to present upon it. So you have now taken a topic that you've had to now learn a lot about something, and you've had to hold yourself to standards that maybe you wouldn't have held yourself to in an intro level, a freshman year class. You've had to hold yourself to the standards of, are there competing explanations? What have I not accounted for? Is there weakness in my data? If so, can I fix it? If I can't, how does that change the conclusions that I have drawn? And that is really the only way forward we have for creating more trustworthy institutions, institutions that produce information that we're willing to trust and we're willing to take. And just the rise of conspiracy theories is this, I think directly related to a lack of trust in the mass media. And just many attitudinal surveys do show us that a lot of these beliefs hold much broader cultural currency than I would like, or many in the room would probably like. So that's to recap here, that's the 3 things you get out of research that have nothing to do with the finding that you have here. Thinking long term, how to do difficult things, and how to evaluate information. So your role as you graduate is not to remember exactly what your probability values were on this study, but to how you can use these knowledge and these skills to contribute to more trustworthy institutions. Because if you accept that sort of trust is lost on a large scale, then the only way to really restore that trust is to do it on the ground level. And that's just a devilishly tricky collective action problem. But it will take, I think, your research skills, really, and a lot more people behind you. So that's why I'm happy to see you here at this conference, and the conference to continue after you and I are done talking today. And so let me just say, I know I speak for your faculty advisors, the faculty, when I say I'm really looking forward to what you have. We're rooting for you, okay? So thank you for listening to me.